Right, good evening, everyone. We have a bit of a windy evening, so I've opted for the couch tonight. So that's why the background looks slightly different. I hope the glare in my eyes are not too bad tonight. I've got the iPhone right in front of my face, and I've opted for the mic because I'm sitting a little bit further, so hopefully it'll be nice and clear without me having to lean into the microphone. Alrighty, so tonight is our final night. It's the night of final conclusions, and tonight we want to deal with the questions, what do we do with this information? But I think the most important question of all, and if you are someone that values the scripture, if you are someone that loves Jesus deeply, and honors the New Testament and the Old Testament as inspired books, then there's really one question. There's really one final question that is a difficult one, but the question is simply, in light of this, what do we do with the New Testament? How do we handle the New Testament? Put in another way, how do we actually read the New Testament? And so I'm going to give you a couple of options tonight. It is, as I've said from the very beginning, this is not it's not a teaching, it's not a revelation, it's not a message. It is simply the bringing to you of information which are very well known in scholarly circles, universities, but not so much in church circles. It just, I've been a pastor for most of my life, and these type of things you just really can't bring on a Sunday morning, and you would understand why. But I do think this is critical information, and I do think that the information to some degree needs to inform our thinking, needs to inform the way that we view things, needs to inform our worldview. Ultimately, we should not be afraid of information when it comes to us. The truth cannot be killed, and the truth will always survive. It's just that we're not always 100% sure what the truth is, but there should be no fear in any one of us as to information that will take the truth away from us. I don't think we need to live with that type of fear. So just quickly, in our final session, just a recap. Last session, we spoke about the proposal to consider the story, the origin story of Lucifer as a case, in a very good case then, of retrojective reinterpretation of the Hebrew Scriptures. Mentioned a couple of things why I think, and this is not a doctrine, it's just a conclusion, that Lucifer is not the name for Satan, and that the origin story is one we read back into the Scriptures. That when the Scriptures were written, to whom they were written, they were definitely not understood in that way. All right, it's always a clue when you have Latin in a Hebrew Bible. Tonight we're going to do a very short portion on the Roman period, which is really early Roman period. Just want to say a couple of things, and then we're going to go to our conclusions tonight, which I think is the most important part of tonight. Just briefly, the early Roman period, we're framing this from 63 BCE. This is more or less the time when Pompey conquered the areas around Judea, until 70 CE, which is the fall of the temple, the second temple then. From as early as 196 BCE, during the Hellenistic period, the Roman Republic was engaged in war with the Seleucid Empire. This is the one from the north. The Roman general Pompey conquered Jerusalem and its surroundings by 63 BCE and declared Herod the Great king of the Jews over Judea. This was by 40 BCE. He ruled under the Roman overlordship until his death in around 4 BCE, when he passed his throne to his sons and established the Herodian dynasty. Herod was a vassal of the Roman Empire, and his rule was granted by the Roman Senate, probably because of his father's good relationship with Julius Caesar, who entrusted Antipater, Herod's father, with the affairs of Judea. He was a good politician, in other words. The point is that now that Jerusalem, the Jews, they again find themselves as a vassal of an empire. This time not the Persian Empire, but this time the Roman Empire. They're paying taxes. They're being ruled by a puppet king, Herod. He is basically a puppet king of Rome. The promise of a strong, independent Jewish kingdom once again seems to elude them. But by this time, the ideas of how evil functions in the world of empires and kingdoms had developed. For instance, if we briefly consider this, in the time of the Torah, let's say, for instance, in the time when, as the biblical account goes, of Joshua and the conquering of the Canaanite city of, that's Jericho, of course, Jericho. We don't read in the Torah about a spiritual fight that really takes place. We don't read that the Canaanites were possessed or were the puppets or the mouthpiece or the arm and extension or a manifestation of evil spirits, princes, or the devil himself. All we have is Joshua going in with the people 7 times 7, the last of the 7 times, the angel of the Lord being with them, but no spiritual warfare that goes on per se. But by the time we get to the book of Daniel, we have spiritual warfare. We have princes over regions, prince of Persia, princes over geographical regions. We have archangels with names. In other words, they're no longer the angel of the Lord, which sometimes even is considered to be God himself in messenger form. We now have separate beings with separate names, identities, characteristics. And there is this warfare between the angelic and the demonic going on over Daniel. So by the time we get to the Roman Empire, there seems to be an idea within, and we can show this because of where the book of Revelation takes us. But let me say this: we can show that by this time there arose an understanding that a nation like, for instance, the Romans were basically a manifestation of evil and a manifestation of the devil and his demonic devices in the land of the Jews. When you read the book of Revelation, this is the type of thing that you pick up. There's a war going on, and although it's Rome against the Jews, it's really actually the principalities through Rome. It's really actually the beast through Rome. It's really actually Satan, the dragon through Rome, that fights with the Christians. Who, of course, has the angels on their side. In other words, we've come a long way from a place where God kind of just seems like in the spiritual, there's just him and only him, and then there's man fighting, to where there now is accepted this idea of a spiritual warfare going on in the heavens, right? So it seems like this development has taken place. Evil spirits now find their expression through our enemies. And there's a small portion that I haven't done much research on, but maybe it's worth mentioning if you ever do any research on the Dead Sea Scrolls of the Qumran caves, which was supposed to be written by the Essenes. And it seems like it is mentioned that in those documents, once again, we have these Essenes demonizing or devilizing their enemies. And so we've come a long way from the idea of an adversary just being a person to now we're at the place, and I'm shortening this whole story. Now we're at a place where people are basically the instruments of those demonic spirits. So it's of that adversary. And so it's kind of like it's been projected away from people, where in the beginning this is not actually what happened. Rome again now was just another manifestation or a puppet of the devil or of Satan. Of course, now that we're in the Hellenistic period, we no longer have Satan, which is the Hebrew, but we now have Diabolos, which is the devil, or the Greek version, of course, because that's the language now spoken by the learned. This devil and his angels now come against the people of God and who are the good. And this is the context into which Jesus appears and arises to great fame, of course, in Judea. He is a Messiah coming to cast out demons, break the power of the devil, so that salvation can come and independence can come and freedom can come and to be established for the Jewish people. This is at least the idea in the beginning. It seems like the disciple also held this view for a long time. That Jesus, being the Jewish Messiah, was actually going to free Israel, free Jerusalem, right? We know that's not really what happened. But this is what they understood, and this is still what Jews today understand by their own prophets. This, I think, is why some of the disciples, after spending so much time with Jesus, still asked him, when will you restore the kingdom of Israel? To them, Messiah was the one who would conquer the devilish, cruel enemy found in the empire of Rome. Reading the book of Revelation from this perspective also helps us to make sense of the appearance of the devil there as a manifestation through the oppressive Roman Empire. This is also possibly the reason for the interchanging use of the idea of powers of the air, principalities of the air, for the actual Roman Empire and the spiritual forces working through them. So I'm just making the point that by the time we get to the New Testament, the end of the first century, we really are dealing with a full-blown idea that the enemies of God are basically the puppets of the devil and his demons. By the time we get to this New Testament, there's full-out war in the heavens, right? God against Satan and God's personified archangels against demonic forces, princes, and demons. This is the world into which Jesus is born. This is the normative, theological framework of the writers of the New Testament, including someone we revere, who is Paul. They only know this worldview, and nothing else is beyond them, and nothing else is beyond them, and the spiritual worldview of the time of the Torah is long lost. The point is here simply just everyone has a context. The New Testament context is this, which we've described over the last couple of weeks. They have not experienced anything else. They know nothing else. And maybe it is a little bit strange to think of it this way, but it does seem like the world of the Torah is long lost by the time we get to the New Testament for the Jews. The ideas about spiritual world, their worldview, had drastically changed and developed. And that's kind of what we try to show during this study. Let me come to my final conclusions tonight, and I might actually be rather short tonight, but I want to make sure I spend enough time on these conclusions because I believe that they're absolutely critical. Let's see how long they'll take me. I've got notes, but you never know what happens here. Final conclusions. A quick summary. The New Testament era's ideas about Satan and demons differ greatly from that of the world of the Torah. What happened? And this study was really meant to illustrate that there was actually a development and also to offer a possible explanation for how it could have occurred. A possible explanation, right? Please understand, I'm not trying to create doctrine. I'm not trying to make people believe certain things. I'm putting forward a very widely accepted scholarly view that just never reaches people who spend their time in church. The study was meant to illustrate a possible explanation for this difference. Okay, let me just mention them quickly. The theological ideas about Satan and the demonic world developed over time as Israel transitioned out from the Canaanite polytheism into the Judaistic monotheism we see and finally meet in the New Testament. And it was a process. Secondly, the two main forces that possibly was responsible for this development could be, number one, the theological landscape that monotheism brought with it. In other words, once monotheism became the accepted, enforced, and practiced view, it brought forth like a type of a theological instability where evil could previously easily be explained as the actions of some of the other gods. Now there was one God, but evil was still there. And so it is very convenient to then take up ideas that explain that there's some other holy evil force in the spiritual world that then takes the blame for everything. A book like Job deals with that concept. Why do people still suffer? It's not God, it's the devil, it's Satan. He tells God to do all these things. Satan, there is no opponent really, but just a different type of servant. Also, the book of Jonah wrestles with the monotheistic idea that if there's only one God, does he love the Assyrians? And you know what happened there. Second force was the influence of the dualistic monotheism of the Zoroastrians. And so I hope you enjoyed that session. But to me, it was a real eye-opener when I first encountered the ideas on Zoroastrianism and how close it really is. It wasn't close to Yahwism or early Judaism, but it is so close to what we read about in the New Testament. It is frighteningly close. It scares me, to be honest. So these are the two forces that change into monotheistic religion, and secondly, the interaction or the influence, the possible influence of the Persian Zoroastrianism. And if you're joining tonight and you've missed some of the sessions, you might need to go and just pop your head in some of the old sessions just to make sure you don't get lost in Zoroastrianism. It's important that you do that session. The third thing I'd like to say in my summary is the core tenets of this development that we saw in Israel's theology. The ones that are relevant for us that we discussed was that there was a development of an evil, rebellious being called Satan, right? There was a construct of the evil spirits or the demons that followed him and are with him and under him. These two, the Satan, devil, and his demons, became and developed to become an official opposition for God. And finally here, the world was understood as essentially a spiritual fight between these two sets of forces. And so, at the end of the day, let me say something risky. Let me say something that I'm jumping the gun a lot. It just doesn't seem like this was the type of world that Torah lived in. There was no fight. There was no gang fight, if I can say. And that the gang fight seemed to have developed and was inherited by the New Testament. And from there on, because of the way we treat Scripture, we crystallized or we fossilized Scripture. The Jews never fossilized their Scripture, but we fossilized our Scripture. And so it is possible that we then inherited this dualistic worldview that essentially this world, this cosmos, this universe is the fight between good forces and evil forces, personified by God, his angels, and Satan and his angels. This is the development, it seems, that had happened. Lastly, one of the differences that we've explored, or the developments, is this is the cultural Jewish norm by the time we get to the New Testament. The writers are born, the New Testament writers, the writers of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Paul, Peter, these writers are born into this worldview. I'd like to say it's the air they breathe, it's the ocean they swim in, and it is the perspective from which each one of them writes. So, for instance, let's take an example. If you think about Jesus and his temptation that's recorded for us in the book of Matthew. When Jesus is tempted in Matthew records it as a visitation from Satan, because his understanding is that this is the force that does this type of tempting evil in the world. So these are the perspectives we get in the New Testament. When Judas goes out to betray Jesus, the writer says, and Satan entered him. Meaning that is their way of saying, that's their way of portraying Judas in the horrible act that was about to take place. There's also the curious account of Jesus after saying to the disciples that, they can't follow him, they're going to be scattered when he gets struck, and they won't be able to follow him. And Peter said, I will follow you wherever you go. Jesus' response here is incredibly interesting, because Jesus doesn't say to him, Peter, you are now listening to the devil, and you are saying the things that Satan or the devil has always said. This is not what Jesus does in that moment, but what he does do is he calls Peter Satan. I'm not sure if it's metaphor or simile or whatever, but it's quite clear to me that Peter is not Satan. But the fact that Jesus can do this tells me that the writers of the New Testament perceives whatever Peter was saying to be a result of demonic or devilish influence. So what you're going to get in the New Testament is always going to be the perspective of this worldview, that the cosmos is in essence a fight between the forces of good and the forces of evil, speaking in a very spiritual sense. So also just keep in mind, and I'm maybe saying a little bit too much now, I didn't really mean to go into this direction too much, but you must remember that Jesus didn't write the New Testament, and what we do have of Jesus, his thought, his words, his actions, are ultimately the perspectives of New Testament writers, people that swim in this ocean and breathe this air. Okay, so I know that at this point, many of you might have many questions. I'm going to list some of these questions I struggle with, questions you might be struggling with, and maybe you haven't thought that far, and some of these questions will create or provoke some thinking within yourself. Here's some of these questions that can arise after all of our discussion together over the last, it's been 9 weeks, people, 3 months, a whole term. Number one, is the information about the Persian and therefore the Zoroastrian beliefs coincidental, or were they real determining factors for the future of Judaism and its beliefs that bleed into the New Testament? Is it coincidental? Is it coincidence that they believed these things and that they ruled over the Jews? Or is this a real factor? Did this really play a factor in the development of Jewish theology? Number two, did the New Testament idea of Satan develop in possibly another way? And maybe you know of another way that we got to the Satan of the New Testament that offers an alternative view of how we got from the world of Torah, where basically there's no devil, to the place in the New Testament where he is the main, well, he's the second main dude. Is the grand opposition to God. And if you do have any ideas, please let me know. I don't know of any other. I'm open to them. Was God working through the prophet Zoroaster? If these, it's one of the questions someone asked, if these ideas of the Zoroastrians were absorbed by the Jews and eventually became the norm of the New Testament, is it possible that God and his Spirit was working through the prophet Zoroaster? That he had some form of truth come through that Persian prophet that helped to bring the Jews into a better belief system, which was more accurate than what was found in the Torah. Don't know. These are just questions. If Zoroastrian beliefs did influence Judaism and by extension Christianity, what should we now believe about Satan? I mean, what do we do with the information? Is Satan an evil spiritual being? Or is he more like the Jews believe, the Rabbinic Judaism, most of Rabbinic Judaism today, that Satan is more like a metaphor, and it is the human projection of our own evil inner inclination? Questions. Did the New Testament writers get it wrong? Is ignoring Israel's history and pagan influences the best way forward? And I'm just say, look, let's just forget about all of Israel's history. We got the New Testament. We're going forward with that. And then simply the last one, I've kind of mentioned this one before. What do we do with Satan from here on? Okay, so I'm not here tonight to give you my views. I'm not here to tell you exactly how I have formulated and exactly what I think about Satan. But I want to put on the table 3 possible avenues that could be followed. Maybe there's more. These are the only 3 that I could muster up, trying to be objective, looking inwards. And I'm trying to think from a perspective of someone like maybe some of you that has been here for the first 9 weeks and you've never really encountered this type of information. And you need to decide what to do with it. And maybe these 3 avenues may help bring some clarity as to which is the more appropriate route for you to follow. Number 1, the first option you have is to ignore. In other words, to ignore the historical context of the origins of the Hebrew Scriptures. In other words, you read the Hebrew Scriptures in complete isolation from the historical context. You ignore the Persians, you ignore the Egyptians, you ignore the Canaanites completely, what they believed and how it might have influenced the Scriptures, and you put the Hebrew Bible, you isolate it from everything else, and you ignore what was going on around it. And doing that, you might be able to say, I'm ignoring the information I've received over the last 9 weeks. I think it's nice. It was interesting. Thanks, Ron, for your time. But I just feel like it'd be better for me to ignore this information we've received. What happens then if you make a decision to ignore the information? There's negatives and positives, right? So the positive about ignoring this information would be that you could carry on with your belief about Satan in the way that you've always had it, and it won't be influenced by these 9 sessions. The negative is you have to close your eyes to the evidence that lies, the context that is and was. And it just seems like, over the last 150 years since we've started to unearth some very interesting archaeological finds. We've learned to decipher Akkadian. The Assyriologists have learned to decipher all these ancient clay tablets, and we are learning more and more and more about the context around in which of the surroundings in which the Bible was formed. And it's going to, the negative part about ignoring it is it's not going to get any easier. There's more and more stuff coming out. But that's a choice. So avenue number 1 is ignore the information. The positive is that you can carry on without having to rethink anything. The negative is that you have to continue to ignore historical context and really things that people consider historical facts. Okay, so that's the first option. Maybe that's for you. This option is not so much for me. Option number two is to say, okay, assume that the Hebrew scriptures and their theology was influenced by its historical context, and that this influence does extend into the New Testament, right? But this was due to true revelation given by God to these other nations. In other words, this option is something I mentioned slightly earlier, and this is a real option to say, hey, wait a minute. And I think someone did mention it. Isn't it possible that God used the Persians, their religion, that God did give the Persians truth, certain amounts of truth, that the idea of demons, archangels, and the gang fight has always been a true idea, one that wasn't explained properly by the Torah, but now God by His Spirit made it known to the Persians, knowing that they'd be in contact with the Israelites, and He would use the Persians to bring them into a better place, to give them a better and an accurate truth. All right, so that's option number two. It's a very tempting option, but once again, it has positives and it has negatives. The positive of this avenue is once again that you can carry on believing whatever you always believed about Satan, the devil, demons, and so on. Because you now just say, well, God used the Persians to bring this information to light. So that's again the positive, these are great positives. Not having to change is a great positive. I mean, you can just carry on with your life the way you want to, and change is difficult. Not change is rather easy, and it makes it a whole lot easier. But the negative part of this, the negative part of this avenue is that you then start thinking, okay, if God brought truth through the Persians, how much truth did He bring through the Persians? And what about the rest of Persian beliefs? What about the rest of Zoroastrian beliefs? What more truth is there in there that we haven't mined yet, that we haven't adopted yet? And then you have to let your mind go and consider, maybe we need to look again at all the Babylonian beliefs. And while we're doing that, let's take the Greeks and the Romans and the Pharaohs and the Egyptians, and let's give the Canaanites another good look at. And while we're at it, let's include the Buddhists and the Hindus. The point I'm trying to make is, where do you draw the line? How do you say, it's only these ideas that God gave to the Persians? Because you can't use the logic that it's confirmed by the New Testament, because that's a circular argument, because it seems quite obvious that the New Testament ideas did come from the Jewish ideas that were rather influenced by the Persians. So the positive, once again, of accepting that God gave the Persians insight is that we don't have to change much. The negative is we now have opened the door to finding truth in many, many places, and we really are at a place of thinking, or then having to being forced to think about, like, where else is truth coming from? And that's the tricky part about such an assumption. Maybe that is for you. Maybe number 2 is for you to assume that the Persians received some form of revelation by the Spirit of God. Number 2 is not for me. Option number 3 could be the hardest of all. Option number 3 goes something like this. We assume that the Hebrew Scriptures, their theology, was indeed influenced by the historical context, which in this case includes Canaanites and the Persians, to such an extent that it did influence the New Testament. It did influence the New Testament. And thus, and this is option number 3, we need to relook, reinterpret, reevaluate how we treat and how we interpret the New Testament, right? And specifically in this case, how we interpret the idea of the satanic and of the demonic and of the gang fight in the New Testament, because it is there, and it's rather prominent, you know. I mean, in Paul it's prominent, Revelations it's prominent. In the Gospels, it's easier to explain. Like, I feel like it'd be easier to explain the Gospels, but Paul's views would rather be hard to just, you know, shove to the side. We can't do that. So option number 3 is, we assume that the Jews were influenced by the Persians. We assume that this influenced the New Testament. And that leaves us with this responsibility to relook, reinterpret the ideas about the demonic and Satan in the New Testament. So what's the positive from this option number 3, avenue number 3? The positive is we don't close our eyes to evidence. We work with the evidence. And we also don't have to go truth-seeking in other religions and try and find out what else the Persians believe that we missed out on. What's the negative? What's the hard part about option number 3? Well, the hard part about option number 3 is we have to relook at the New Testament, and we have to reconsider what the actual context of the New Testament might be like, and whether the context needs to be pushed and perpetuated into eternity. Considering the negative is that we have to consider a different view or a different interpretation of the New Testament's portrayal of Satan. And therefore, the way we use and read the New Testament for application in our lives. Realizing that carried over traditions might actually be weaved into our New Testament. Now, I can just give you a brief example. Something like slavery, for instance, is weaved into the New Testament because it is the context. It's the sea they swim in, it's the air they breathe. None of us today go around making slaves. We're against it. We believe it's against the Spirit of God. And how do we explain this? We say, no, that's just part of the context. It's something we've grown out from. Well, option number 3 would be to have to consider the New Testament in that same light when it comes to the ideas of Satan. So, realizing that we, even in our New Testament, we have carried over traditions, weaved into our scriptures, the New Testament that we believe is inspired, and also, therefore, into our faith. And then the hard part is that it takes wisdom to mine the truth from this. I like to use the illustration of an orange, where, you know, if you want orange juice, you have to go through the skin, you have to go through all the fiber and the compartments, and if you squeeze that orange, what comes out is the beautiful orange juice. And possibly option number 3 is to relook the New Testament, to realize that not all of it is juice. Some of it is fiber, some of it is skin, some of it you can't drink because it's carried over tradition. In that sense, to me, the juice of the New Testament is the person of Jesus. Anyway, so option number 3 is to say we accept everything and we relook at the New Testament. The positives about that, we are dealing with the evidence. We're not ostriching head in the sand when it comes to evidence, and at the same time, we don't go truth seeking in other places. But we do need to relook, reinterpret, and have a look at the New Testament to see how much of the carried over tradition God is actually expecting us to also keep on carrying over. Now, option number 3 seems to be the option for me and the way forward for me. But I cannot choose for you, and nor do I really want to. I've also come to the conclusion, and I will say this kind of coming to an end to these sessions, I've also come to the conclusion that although a right belief is important, it was never as important as loving people to Jesus. The Sermon on the Mount does not tell us what to believe. It tells us how to behave. It tells us how to love. It tells us what character to have. Jesus did not really go around telling people exactly what to believe, not even about himself. We make a big deal of right belief. In our case now, Frans, if you don't believe in this version of Satan, this and that might happen to you. Jesus was not so obsessed with having the exact right doctrine. Jesus was obsessed with loving people. And number 2, getting rid of hypocrisy. So ultimately, whichever route you choose after these 9 weeks, you might choose one and later choose another. You might choose one and grow out of it at some point, adopt into another. It's not that important. But I hope that you have enjoyed at least taking this journey with me. It was an interesting one. I really enjoyed it. I learned so much more. Every time I go through these, I'm doing it in about 2 or 3 groups, 4 groups at the same time. So I've done these sessions many times, and every time I go through them, I see things differently, and I keep on growing in my understanding of them. I hope you've enjoyed them, and I hope that at least some of this will stay with you. The only thing I would like to leave with you tonight is, for what it's worth, my method for finding truth in this life. I have a 3-prong approach, 3 things that I use to test whether something is true, whether something might be only tradition, whether it might be worth holding on, or it might be worth kicking out and getting rid of completely. 3 things. The first one is scripture in context. I grew up with a great love for the scriptures. I spent the first 10 years of being a pastor. I actually felt like God was saying to me not to read anything else, and I didn't for about 10 years. In the last 5 years of my life, I started reading extensively. I think through the COVID period, I read about 60 books on everything from science, philosophy, archaeology, history, you name it. I was reading it. Spirituality, to open up my horizons a little bit. And that's when I started to discover that scripture on its own can actually be quite lethal. Scripture has to be read in context. And to know the context, you need to know something about the history of scripture. And scripture is not written all together. It's written over hundreds of years. So you need to know a lot about history to have an idea of why people were saying what they were saying. And it's a very interesting field, but it takes away a certain naivety of just coming to the Bible, paging and reading the scripture and make it applicable to yourself. But at the same time, I've also found it to be quite liberating, not having to push God into the box that I grew up with. So the first weapon, if I can say, or tool for recognizing truth is scripture, but in context. Scripture is an inspired, ancient journey with God, and it's mirrored in the writings of people which I believe was inspired. So that's the first thing I use as a measuring stick or a tool for finding truth. I hope that in these sessions I've given you an idea of what scripture in context looks like. And it's a completely different way of approaching the scripture when you value its context. If you had to go and do a study on Satan without being sensitive to the timeline, who was writing what, where they were when they were writing it, who was lording over them, what language it was written in, you would not come to the same conclusions we have come to in the sessions. So these sessions were an introductory course, introduction to the idea of scripture in its proper context. My second tool or method for finding truth is the God-given reality. Personally, I think that Christianity, it needs a good slap of reality. Coming to the realization, the sobering realization, is that the reality we have, the world and the life that God has given us, is in fact given to us by God and looks the way it should. A God-given reality. So this for me means my experience, science and reason to some degree. A lot of people don't like mentioning reason. They'd rather mention faith. But the truth is that all faith is based on reason, just different reasons. So the second method, the second tool in my toolbox is a God-given reality. I assess my reality, the reality of life. I look at it from a scientific place, I look at it from a reasonable place, and also from my experience. The world looks the way it does because God has given it to us in this way. So this helps us and can definitely help you in this case. Lastly, and maybe most importantly, is the measurement or the tool of the indwelling spirit. Something that's become very, very important to me over the last couple of years is to understand that, when Jesus was doing his final prayer in John 17, he made a statement there about truth, and he made it like this. He says, and the Spirit will lead us in all truth. The Spirit will teach us about him and the Father. What he should have said there, according to most of us, is, and when you read the Bible, you'll find the truth. But that's kind of not what he's doing in that moment. He really sets out a different type of boundary for us. Although he valued the scriptures, make no mistake, and so do we. But the benchmark for truth is the indwelling Spirit. That's the promise from the Father. That's the third person of the Trinity. That's God. The Bible is unfortunately not God, as most people many Christians might think. But the indwelling Spirit, in other words, what I'm trying to say is, inside you there is a conscience that is infused with the Spirit of God and that has the ability to recognize truth. And so this indwelling Spirit is conscience. It's that which brings peace and feels right. So my method for finding truth: scripture in context, God-given reality, and an indwelling Spirit. Guys, I really want to thank you for journeying with me over this last 3 months. I've had a blast. I've had a good couple of laughs and giggles after some of these sessions. And I know this is not very interactive, but I hope that you've had a similar experience. I'm still very open to any questions that you might have, maybe suggestions for future studies. Just while we're talking about that, if you stay in the group, this group will kind of go dead now. Nothing will happen in it, but it will stay closed and private. When you stay in the group, then when I start the next study, it'll be announced within the group. So if you're interested in staying, there you'll get an announcement for the new group within this group. Let me know what topics interest you. I want to do this more often. It is something I thoroughly enjoy, but to be honest, it takes an immense amount of time to put something like this together. It kind of consumes me, and it's hard to do anything else while I'm busy doing this. But this is something that I feel is really in line of what I would like to be doing in the future. Drop me some notes on some topics that you would maybe like to have a look at, or you'd want me to have a look at it. If there's something that tickles my fancy or something that I already feel like I can bring some form of a contribution, then I'd also like to do that. Thank you so much for being with me during this time. May God give you insight. May the Spirit of God lead you in truth. Thank you so much. Cheers, guys, and love to you all.